Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to continue on in Unit 6 discussing industrial and economic development. In some of our previous videos what we've been looking at is some ways that people have considered helping to reduce the development gap. Of course, the development gap being that gap that exists between the more developed countries and less developed countries. And so we've looked at some different approaches. We looked at the self-sufficiency approach, we looked at international trade approach. So what we're going to look at today are some organizations who have been established in order to try and help to reduce that development gap. Now, as in most cases, whenever you have organizations, especially international organizations involved, there are going to be those who are in favor of the use of those organizations, and then there are going to be critics of those organizations. So it's important to weigh both sides. It's important to look at the evidence and then kind of come to your own conclusions about those particular organizations. So the first ones we're going to look at are just two examples of international financial institutions, aside from, and these are not private institutions like we think of banks or we think of lending agencies or things like that. These are countries coming together to try and promote development. So we have what's called the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, and we have what's called the World Bank. So basically the mission, or at least the stated mission of these two organizations, is to try and improve the economic statuses of countries around the world, and then in turn to improve the socioeconomic statuses of people within the world. And so the way that this is done, or the way that they go about doing this, is to try and provide funds for less developed countries so that they can develop their economy and they can develop their country. So the purpose of this, or the whole idea behind the International Monetary Fund, is when you have a lot of these less developed countries, obviously development is a very expensive endeavor. And so what the International Monetary Fund seeks to do is provide the capital that's necessary for a lot of these countries to try and improve their developmental status. So money for things like basic infrastructure, so roads, electricity, clean water, government expenditures in the social sector. So providing investments for maybe startup companies or things along those lines, for ports, for rail lines, any of these types of things that the government of that country thinks that it needs in order to begin on the road to development. So the loans are provided at low rates. Now, low rates can be kind of subjective to the person you're talking about, but the idea there is you provide them at a reasonable rate so that the country can use the money to develop, and so they're not saddled with a bunch of debt that's just going to cause them issues in the future. So of course that's kind of where the rub comes in, is that a lot of people they look at the rates and they look at the loans and say that basically this is just a trap that more developed countries are using in order to create another sense of dependency on the more developed countries and to lock them into the system that they've created. Again, I keep referencing the video. It's called Life and Debt. I think it's a great illustration of this point for people who feel this way. Now, with the loans that are being provided, stipulations are created. So basically what happens is the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or any of the other institutions, they basically get to set up the parameters that are going to be met, the conditions that will be met in order for the government to receive the money. So whether it is interest rates within the country itself, whether it's what the money can go towards, whether it is the value of currencies, basically these organizations get to set the parameters. Not unlike when you go and receive money from a bank. A bank gets to set stipulations on what you can spend money on and the rates that you'll pay back and things like that. So it's not that terribly different from personal loans that you might get. So anyway, the stipulations are that the money needs to be used for economic improvements within the country. You need to be able to prove that they're being used for economic improvements. Also, the IMF and World Bank encourage a move towards privatization. So we're talking about the private ownership of businesses. We're talking about private ownership, private development, instead of using money for establishing public entities, government entities, creating a larger bureaucracy within the government and things like that. And the idea there is to try and promote greater efficiency to improve the economic situation of the country, so that the country can kind of use this startup capital, as it were, to improve its financial situation. Again, there are criticisms of these large institutions. Basically, the criticisms that we've talked about in the past these are pretty much the same criticisms. Basically, these are just institutions that are set up by more developed countries as a way to control less developed countries, and they're using this mechanism of debt and of money and the stipulations that are created to force the less developed countries into the game that they have created. It's kind of like walking into a friend's house and playing a game by the house rules. Most of the time the house rules are set up to benefit those who are part of the house, because that's how you understand how to play that way. So that's the way a lot of people, especially in less developed countries, see these large financial institutions. So they have the criticisms of them, but then also they recognize it's very difficult to play in the global economy, or to be a part of the global economy without getting help from either of these institutions. So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And another one is that both of these institutions are created to fit into the worldview of the more developed country and how the global economy should work. So because the more developed countries make the institutions, they're the ones who get to make the rules. And so basically they get to make the rules to fit the way that they see the world, the way the global economy should work, things like that. And of course, less developed countries and people who are advocates for them against more developed countries don't necessarily see this as fair. Some other things that some other institutions that we see as those who are trying to reduce the development gap is various trade agreements and trade blocs. So basically what we're looking at is countries coming together to try and create trade agreements and trade arrangements that are going to try to benefit the economic situation in each of the member countries. And so with that, each of the countries of the trading agreement or the trade bloc typically will reduce or remove trade barriers, will give countries what are called preferred nation status, which means they're going to give them favorable trade stipulations. They're going to treat the goods that come into their country with the exact same scrutiny that they would treat goods that are created in their own country. There's no additional scrutiny. They're going to lower tariffs. They're going to lower taxes. And so, again, the idea here is that countries across these trade blocs are going to benefit mutually from their trade agreement. So with this, we talked a little about the international trade approach. The difference here is that instead of the whole global economy working on this concept of free trade, basically you have various regions, and you've seen the kind of the regionalization of this, the various regions coming up with trade agreements. You have NAFTA, you have the European Union, you have various trade blocs in Asia. And so it's almost like regions being pitted against regions, where if a country is a part of a trade agreement, potentially that could block them out of trade agreements, block them out or not give them as favorable status against countries that are in a different trade agreement. So it's kind of interesting the way that that's worked out. But again, in this situation, some of these trade agreements and trade blocs have been seen as tools of more developed countries. With the more developed countries, they have larger economies. They have more money. So a lot of times they're the ones who kind of get to set the rules for the trade agreements, because more than likely the less developed country needs the more developed country more than the other way around. So what's been happening recently is that you've seen various trade agreements being reached and trading blocs being established to try and benefit some of the developing countries and block out the more developed countries, almost to thumb their nose at the more developed countries, but also to develop trade agreements that have been developed outside of the use of more developed countries, to kind of block out the more developed countries and create development within their own trade bloc. So some examples of this: OPEC, not so much a trade agreement as obviously the oil petroleum producing cartel, to control not only production but also price of petroleum. Similar situation though, where you had several countries come together basically to thumb their nose at more developed countries and kind of push their weight around on the global scale through the use of petroleum production. Probably the best example though is here in recent past has been what's called the BRICS. The BRICS it's kind of a trading bloc trade agreement that's coming up between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So these are some of the emerging economies in the world. Russia's kind of been on the world stage, but it's just the economy hasn't been quite as strong as the other more developed countries in Western Europe and the United States. So the idea here is that these countries who, not necessarily overtly antagonistic to more developed countries, but always haven't seen eye to eye, but feel like they're not respected by some of the more developed countries. So they've all kind of come together with that common grievance to try and create trade agreements between each other to tie their economies more closely together, so that they hopefully can again kind of thumb their nose at more developed countries. The last thing we're going to talk about today are what are called non-government organizations. So these non-government organizations or NGOs are not necessarily meant for overt development, but rather to kind of fill the gaps of some of the social and human rights issues that are found in less developed countries. So they're nonprofit organizations that are almost strictly used to benefit people, not necessarily governments, but people within less developed countries. And so you have some examples there of like Doctors Without Borders, and obviously I spelled borders wrong. I apologize for the typo. You have Save the Children, and so they work on a variety of different issues. Basically, what they try and do is they try to fill the gap where governments aren't able to step in, or the country is not well developed enough to provide for some of the people in their country, and so they step in and they try to provide some of those services. They try to provide aid for the people in their countries. Again, this isn't necessarily to develop the country, but to provide some of the services that the people in the country might be missing as a result of its low level of development. So anyway, that's all that we have that's all that we have time for today. I hope that you found that to be helpful. If you have any questions, of course, leave those in the comment box below, and I hope to see you next time.